All right. Hello, and thanks for joining the next data pipeline webinar. Today, we have an exciting presentation with one of our strategic partners, Fivetran, on the power and benefits of having a modern data stack. A few notes before we get started. This session is being recorded, and the recording, as well as any additional resources, will be emailed to you in the next day or so. Additionally, we will be launching a few polls during this session, and we encourage any feedback or engagement on those polls to help the presenters tailor the presentation to your interests and needs, because we definitely want this to be an informative and beneficial session for you. Lastly, we encourage you to utilize the chat or questions window found at the bottom of your Zoom screen to pose any questions you may have during this session. We'd be happy to answer these as we go along. A few introductions. My name is Rachel Mason. I'm the marketing specialist here at Technion Data Solutions, helping out with this series. And Technion is happy to be hosting this series as well as three others in data science, visual analytics, and data strategy. So be sure to check out our other exciting upcoming webinars and our webinar archive library. You can see here are a few of the previous webinars in the data pipeline series. So all of these can be found on our website. And with that, I'm going to pass it off to Technion's Chief Technology Officer, Jonathan Agee.
Thanks, Rachel. Really appreciate it. And thanks to everyone who's joining today. We do have a great session, like Rachel said, tackling the question of how modern data stacks power Agile analytics, specifically with Fivetran. And so I want to give a little bit of background to this topic as well as to who Technion is. So we'll start off with answering that question first. Who is Technion? What are we all about? Technion is a full-service data solutions consulting firm. We've been around a little over 20 years now. We're based out of the DFW area here in Texas. We've had the privilege of serving hundreds of clients over those 20 years. And we have about 65 folks on staff. We're primarily employee-based model and really love working with our clients to drive strategic impact for them. So 4 key practice areas: data pipelines, data visualization, data science, data governance. As you heard from Rachel, we have some great webinars and content in all of those areas. So definitely check those out. For us, partnerships are a key way that we go to market and work in the technology space. And so you can see here some industry recognition that we've received from some of our key partners. And so as we've developed and grown over the years, we've had the privilege of being recognized as Partner of the Year for various partners. And this is why we're here today working with Fivetran, and we're super excited to share what Fivetran brings to the table as a technology partner for us. So let's talk a little bit more about the webinar that we have today. And I want to highlight this concept of data pipelines since that's really the area that we're focused in on. And so we like to think about data pipelines as everything that goes into getting data into an end state where it's going to be used by the broader organization for analytics. So that fits into a broader data and analytics architecture. And so we've shared some of these things over the last webinars in our series. So previous ones dig more into this area if you're interested. But this is a architecture that is generic because it applies to, it really can be flexible to apply to everyone who's working with data and analytics. Some of these boxes apply to each customer, not all. But what we're talking about today is really going to be digging into the data loading and streaming. And so our last webinar was around cloud considerations for data pipelines. And so that ties right into our modern data stack that we're going to be talking and hearing more about today from Fivetran. And so these were the 4 areas that in our last webinar we highlighted as considerations for your cloud data pipeline. And so we're going to be diving into that third one there that you see, data loading and streaming. And so as you see on this diagram, Fivetran sits right there in that data loading and streaming, bringing your data into your cloud data warehouse. We'd love to hear from you today with a poll of where your cloud data warehouse sits today, or maybe you're not in the cloud, and that's part of what you're interested in learning about. So if you could share with us, what is your data warehouse platform today, and that would be awesome, and will give us context for our presenters. So with that, I'd like to introduce Brandon from Fivetran, and I'll let him take away the presentation, and we will have a Q&A at the end. And we'll also have a chance for you to share what you'd be interested in taking away from this session.
Thanks. Give me a second to pull up my screen right now with the, just a quick introduction to myself first. My name is Brandon Chen, and I'm currently a product marketing manager here at Fivetran. But prior to that, my experience at Fivetran was also in working with a lot of our sales team to secure that technical validation and understand what's happening with data stack. And the first question that I always got asked was, when we're talking about data stacks, when we're talking about or data pipelines, however you want to refer to it, from that full beginning load to the later on data modeling, the question that I hit most frequently was, what makes a data stack really modern, right? Because there are data stacks that have been around for a while. The hard-coded ETL has been around since 1970s or so. Oracle has been around since 1970s, 1980s or so. So databases, data pipelines, data sources, of course, have always been around. And a database would be nothing without downstream reports. So in some sense, we can consider that a data stack. When we think about what separates modern from legacy, a lot of it does refer to the cloud, the onset of the cloud, and how that applies to different tools and how different tools are using that. But the simplest way that I could think of to describe a data stack and how a data stack can be truly modern comes down to two words: this workflow management. At the end of the day, software should be made so that you don't have to manage your processes as much. You don't have to do as much work. And that's always the goal, right? Is to figure out how to streamline your workflows so that you can become more efficient, so that you can do the job that you're actually hired to do, drive the insights you are hired to find, without having to spend so much time managing the tools that are supposed to get you there faster. So we just take a quick snippet, a part of the data stack, the data warehouse, as an example. It's pretty popular to have a data warehouse either in SQL Server or Oracle or any traditional relational database. But there's the onset of tools like Snowflake. And here I'm using Snowflake as an example, primarily because they're pretty hot news right now with their semi-recent IPO still doing pretty well. And some of the things that brought them to that state were that workflow management piece. Yes, a lot of it originated as being part of the cloud, but another segment of that was that the tool is designed so that you don't have to manage a lot of the traditional database management features that you used to need in the past. For example, how to optimize queries so they run efficiently. You don't have to necessarily spin down the entire instance and shut it down while you're trying to scale up additional clusters for compute. You don't have to shut it down while you're trying to get more storage for that database. And setup is literally in minutes due to its easy to use UI and no infrastructure management for Snowflake. All of that results in a warehouse that literally anybody can set up in a couple of minutes. And I've done multiple trials myself just to work out what it looks like for like a new flow and show people how quick it is to actually set up each component of the data stack. Because at the end of the day, it does go back to that workflow management piece. How quickly can we get things set up so that we can drive faster insights? So some of those benefits of a modern data stack where you don't need to manage as much of each of the products and the tools just work with no technical barriers to entry are more agility, more bandwidth, and more data. Ultimately, by being able to set up these tools in minutes and hours and half an hour or so, you're able to get your data stack set up. You're able to test whether components are satisfactory according to your business requirements. And it's faster because a lot of these tools are cloud-based. All modern data stack tools having that infrastructure already in place, not necessarily needing to manage that yourself. It tends to run a lot quicker than your standard, let's say, under-provisioned MySQL instance that you have set up specifically for analytics, all the way from the data pipeline to the warehouse to the downstream BI reporting. None of that has to be constrained by, let's say, your desktop that you're working off of or your laptop that you're working off of. You also have more bandwidth to do stuff. Like I briefly mentioned at the beginning, less workflow management means more time for you to focus on activities that were actually in your job description, rather than having to spend mundane time doing things like figuring out how to do some manual exports and figuring out how to put that in a report that makes sense, and then perhaps export the report to something like Excel for visualization. You don't need to do any of that with these tools that are so easy to set up and so easy to use that multiple people in your organization can easily pick them up. And finally, just more data. Because the tools are so easy to use, and because there's none of that additional, like, let's say, need to learn how to program in C, Java, Python. All of these tools make it possible for you to store as much data as you can to meet the business stakeholder needs. You're continuously onboarding more sources in your data, more data sources within your company. Let's say marketing. I know as part of our marketing team, we've onboarded, I want to say, like 4 or 5 tools in this past half a year. So it's continuously going to be more of these requests to store this data. And the data teams will continually be tasked with wanting to figure out how can we learn from the past to affect what our future strategy will be. Ultimately, what this results in is abstracting away a lot of the technical details, a lot of that management, so that it's just easier for people to make requests to the team and easier for the team to follow that request from end to end without any unforeseen hiccups, like not having a technical resource to manage all of these tools. And when I'm talking about the modern data stack, or when Technion is talking about modern data pipeline, this is just a reiteration of what that means in a more simplified version. You already have the data sources that your company's been using. There's probably a few more that you're eyeing that are on the roadmap that you would like to bring into your analytics stack. But the other tools are what I'll be going into a little bit more today around the data ingestion tool. Of course, I'll be going over what you should be looking for in a data pipeline, as well as how Fivetran fulfills those needs. The data destination, this might be a cloud data warehouse. It might be a cloud data lake, such as Delta Lake by Databricks. And finally, data visualization. What should you be looking for in a BI tool, in a data visualization tool that makes it easiest for the companies that the teams that you're working with to understand all the great work that you're doing. So first, with data ingestion tool, a few things to look for, a few things that you should demand as requirements as part of your pipeline are that, one, of course, that all of it is able to work with your data destination. You're able to pull from all the different data sources that you have in your company to all put it in one place so that everybody has one raw repository of data to look at, so that everyone's working off the same data for continued insights as you move forward. Secondarily, with the pipeline tool, just like you would expect if you were hard coding an ETL script yourself, the data should be reliable. And part of that is guaranteeing idempotence. So part of it is making sure that data integrity is preserved no matter whether or not there's like an API outage or like a database connectivity issue. And also making sure that the process doesn't automatically do something like duplicate everything from the last step, which results in duplicate data in your warehouse and makes it harder to parse those insights and trust those insights. And finally, that fully management piece, not having to manage any of that workflow, not having to manage things like infrastructure, and the tool, and wanting a tool to update itself. Because in this modern age, with so many different data sources, so many different APIs to keep track of, so many different schema changes that are happening in your database as you're tracking new events or new fields or new products, all of that has to push change in the pipeline as well. So you want the pipeline to have that fully management aspect as well. And with no surprise, I'm going to recommend Fivetran here for the data pipeline because we fulfill all of those different needs. From the 150 data sources we have set up, all of which require no engineering, no coding, and no maintenance going forward. So when we are talking about native pipelines here at Fivetran Native Connectors, what we're talking about is a simple setup form that typically starts with OAuth or perhaps requires an API key copy and pasted from the data sources themselves. And from there, the Fivetran architecture will automatically create the schema and drop the data into underlying tables, making sure to keep that updated. And of course, following that idempotent philosophy, we are continuously saving cursors so that we're never going back to go into the platform and potentially pull duplicate data or any of that, because we're continuously updating our state of when we last synced. And of course, Fivetran's cloud native as well. We're essentially a web application that you can set up without needing to connect or host Fivetran or download Fivetran onto any of your servers and then have to manage that infrastructure going forward as that continues to create tech debt. So with Fivetran, our engineers are hard at work behind the scenes, updating our code for all of our different sources as they continue to advance. And for things like schema change within databases or custom fields within the applications, those will automatically get detected and then brought into your data warehouse. All of it, of course, with the goal of making your analytics more agile for you to get more data and for you to essentially democratize this more so that more people can make requests of data they want to bring into the warehouse, and you can just have it there ready to answer questions. When we're talking about data destinations, there are a few considerations here, of course, as well. Typically, you might be looking for a columnar stored data database. If you're looking for more of a relational database, similar model where it's easier immediately to set up to query with SQL. And if your team is already used to working with one of those legacy relational databases, and you're noticing that, for example, some of the transactions are some of the analytics queries are starting to slow down, that's when I would start looking at like a columnar store database, because they are typically a lot faster to work with these types of analytics queries as opposed to being focused on getting ongoing transactions like ongoing events, whether they're product or marketing. Typically, a modern data destination that you'll be looking for has some idea of a compute and store model where cheap storage should be a given for how cheap, like let's say USB flash drives have gotten. The same goes for enterprise storage as well. So there's ongoing creation of data year over year, and companies now, it's not rare to see multiples, tens, hundreds of terabytes of data. So cheap storage is definitely a consideration, especially as your company continues to be more data driven. And you want all of those events, all those different signals within your centralized analytics repository for ongoing analytics after that. You should also easily be able to scale compute so that you don't need to take your destination down while you're doing so, and therefore stop the analytics processes that are going on. There shouldn't be that long downtime. And of course, you'll need to scale compute as you continue to gather more data, primarily because the amount of queries that you're running and the resource consumption of those queries will continue to grow as the data set grows. And then finally, going back to that workflow management part, we need to make sure that there are common maintenance needs, common compliance needs that should be fulfilled. And a lot of this is just the contextual stuff around the database, such as you don't need to necessarily worry about query concurrency as your team scales, as the data grows, as you're continuing to run more queries, because your data team is doing so well that everyone is making more requests. Or even things like role-based access control. All of that should be easy to navigate and shouldn't require that you have to pour through, let's say, 100 pages of documentation before you are able to figure that out. But at the end of the day, for me, when it comes to picking a data destination, the question I ask myself is, what is my use case? It might be okay to start with your transactional database as your analytics database for the short term, because, for example, the amount of queries you're running aren't going to lock any of the tables that your transactions are going into. You might also want to pick something like a Snowflake, a BigQuery, Amazon, and Azure Synapse, depending on what cloud you're already in or what tools you've already had familiarity with in the past. Or you might want to go with something like Delta Lake by Databricks to satisfy, let's say, your data science models that you're used to working with and running with Spark. And those examples I mentioned were highlighted here with Snowflake, Google BigQuery, Azure Synapse, and Amazon Redshift, falling more in that columnar store warehouse sort of model. And Delta Lake by Databricks is a pretty flexible model that sits on top of either S3 or either your Azure storage buckets, which you should be familiar with if you're in either of those ecosystems, and just makes it so much easier to programmatically run models and feed that data in. For this next segment about data visualization, there are additional considerations here as well. Some of it comes down to empowering your organization with different teams having different setups. You might have a centralized data analytics org, or it might be that that analyst is actually embedded in each of the teams. So a marketing analyst might sit with marketing, or a finance analyst might sit with the finance team, all to help them drive insights and figure out what's going on with the company, given the large volume of data that they have. Taking that one step further, for each of these analytics organizations, they might be looking for tools that their stakeholders can easily slice and dice themselves, or they might just be looking for easily shareable dashboards reports, depending on who is requesting the data, dependent on how much the person requesting the data would like to be able to play with it themselves. So depending on what your use case is there, you're going to want to make sure that you're looking for a tool that easily satisfies those, whether it's being able to email out a report at a weekly cadence or a daily cadence, or being able to set up something like Looker via their modeling layer for other people to easily explore. And then let's talk about data visualization. This is probably the thing that you're most interested in if you're the power user of the data visualization tool and expected to create these reports or set up the self-service model for other people. How are people ingesting this, the reports that they get today? Are there any complaints they have about the specific dashboards or reports that they're getting? And whether or not if it's a self-service model, if they're able to quickly and easily look through and find the metrics that they need, because you're able to do things like add a little definition for them in the data visualization tool itself. And the last thing I put here was modeling. Modeling could really be, we could probably use several different terms here, but ultimately what it translates into is, again, use case. Whether or not the tool that you have has the, let's say, transformation capabilities or data science model compatibility that allows you to quickly and easily work to draw the insights that you are looking for. And some examples here, again, some popular ones that we see are from the Google family, both Looker and Google Data Studio, with, let's say, Data Studio is even free to start and free to set up a trial as well. I believe all of these have some sort of trial component, but going down, there's also Tableau, which has been in the space for a long time. Sigma's sort of up and coming, and they have a more spreadsheets-like sort of functionality, which makes it pretty easy for people to set up. Mode has compatibility with both R and Python, which makes it a pretty unique proposition in the space as well. And of course, if you're already in the Azure ecosystem, Power BI tends to be a pretty popular pick too. With that being said, let's jump into these questions.
So Brandon, this is Jonathan again here. We've got several questions coming in, and some really good ones. So first, we'll start with this one. And someone said they're putting you on the spot a little bit, and that's great. That's what we're all about here, is getting real answers to real questions. So give us some distinguishing features around Fivetran as compared to other solutions like Talend, Matillion, Informatica, those other tools that are out there that also can move data, right? Give us some of those distinguishing features if you can.
Yeah, great question. I think Informatica, Talend, let's say Dalboomi, a lot of these have been in the space for a while. So when a lot of people think about ETL tools, that's one of the first that comes to mind. So it gets confusing, and I get it, because a lot of I'll look at our website, I'll look at their website, and then it'll all say native connectors, native components. And I'm going to go off script here a little bit and just show what I mean when I say that a Fivetran connector is super easy to set up, and that all of the Fivetran connectors that we have are set up to easily be managed by anybody. So when some of these other more legacy ETL vendors are talking about their setup, they're talking about making sure that you understand what API to use. They're talking about making sure that you can pull in like some specific OAuth token for them to use. But for Fivetran, when I'm talking about that OAuth and that setup, This is literally the entire setup. You name the destination schema and you click authorize, and that'll take you to Salesforce to log in. And from there, what Fivetran does is fully manage that schema going forward. So some of the other tools might not have compatibility for generic term is schema drift, but ultimately, let's say in Salesforce, somebody adds a custom field. Fivetran will automatically pick up that custom field and then bring it into the warehouse. And typically the way that we work and the way that we improve on the warehouse, because we have so many of these partnerships with all of our destinations that we're working with, we're able to make sure that our query consolidation before hitting the warehouse means minimal compute on the warehouse side as well. But if I could sum this up in one or two sentences, it would primarily be easier setup, no maintenance going forward, and then larger breadth of sources for these native connectors.
Okay, that's super helpful. So I think that the key element that I heard there was just kind of the ease of setup, and I think that ties back to your original presentation where you're talking about what makes something modern, right? How does it make it a modern data stack? And that is really kind of that automation of the workflow, right? And the agility that you can work. Now, we had another question and kind of going down the same path and maybe comparing Fivetran to a tool like Alteryx, right? And so this, Technion is an Alteryx partner as well as a Fivetran partner. And so Brandon, I'll let you kind of answer that. Maybe what's different about like an Alteryx or maybe even a Matillion that they do that Fivetran doesn't, right? And that Fivetran does that they don't.
So Alteryx, I like Alteryx as a tool. I think it's a really interesting tool. As far as I know about Alteryx, their primary focus is around helping out your data science teams and not necessarily data ingestion. But they have a data ingestion tool within their platform. Similar like how Matillions looks, it's a little more complicated, but with both those Alteryx and Matillion tools, a lot of it is GUI based to set up, where you can drag and drop some sort of pre-made components like a connection component or like a start flow component or an end flow component. But ultimately, I think Alteryx's focus is slightly different from Fivetran in the sense that Alteryx has this data ingestion capability, but it's not their core feature of their product. And then similarly with Matillion, from what we can see from their website and what we can see from their news releases, they are focused on being the best transformation company in the space that they can. So while they might have started with an ETL tool, might have started with data integration, they're slowly starting to pivot towards that transformation side and making it easy to do that sort of like GUI-based transformation or graphical user interface-based transformations.
Absolutely. So I think Brandon, completely agree with everything you said. Really, Alteryx very much focused on kind of that business user and or like the data science team, right, where they're looking to do kind of that data prep transformation workload. And Matillion is doing that same workload more kind of in the data warehouse space, right, on top of your data that's already in Snowflake or Synapse or whatever your cloud data warehouse is. Whereas Fivetran's really carved out this niche of loading the data in and being the best at that, right? Is that a fair way to sum up what I'm hearing?
Yeah, thanks for that wrap up.
Very good, very good. All right, so maybe getting into more of like a technical question. You've talked a couple times about like how Fivetran makes this process easy by creating a data model, and you even talked about like custom fields and things like that. So I think something that folks would be really concerned about is like what happens if like a column is deleted, or what happens, how does it track like changes to your schema, right? And is that going to break my downline workflows, right, that are dependent on that? So maybe you could touch on that.
Yeah, so there's two large buckets that we can kind of think about this in. One is, let's say, cloud applications, and the other being databases. With cloud applications, we're using actually their internal system tables available through the APIs to understand what's been changed, checking various column timestamps and making cross references between tables to understand updated data, new data, or perhaps deleted data, so that we can accurately replicate that into the warehouse as well. When it comes to databases, what we're using there is we're using the logs. So rather than the traditional method of, let's say, pull everything or use a timestamp column that may have timestamp granularity issues leading to data integrity problems, we're using those direct change logs within each database themselves to track those changes, and which ultimately results in a faster ETL and less resource intensive one, because we're not doing that full table scan and full table comparison, and rather just reading direct changes and applying those to the warehouse after doing that query consolidation. And it's through those two replication methodologies that we can do things like that additional column tracking, like additional tables being added in, like columns being removed, and us stopping from writing into those different tables after we've detected that. So the way that the architecture for Fivetran was set up was really set up to do a lot of this cross-reference to make sure that we're not missing any new data or updated data that's coming in, or deleted columns or deleted tables, so that your warehouse is a one-to-one replica of the data sources and continues to be updated at the frequency that you configure within the product.
That's fantastic, Brandon. So really, again, goes back to so many things you said in the kind of the discussion around what makes something modern, right? Is just taking away those workloads so that you can focus on the data and what insights you need to gain from it, as opposed to, you know, kind of the mundane, how do I handle a change to an API or to a data structure, right? Mm-hmm. So let's kind of, I lost my train of thought there. Let's look at a couple more questions here. So we have one that's a really good question around what is your support for kind of more the transformation side. Can you talk about what you can offer folks if they're using Fivetran for kind of that extract and load side of things? What about the transformation side?
Yep, that's a good question too. So one thing that I kind of omitted, and part of that like fully managed workflow piece that I was mentioning, was that Fivetran does a few transformations natively across all the different connectors. For, let's say, web applications, we're constantly getting we're typically getting a response to JSON, but that JSON needs to be translated to downstream schemas and tables. And as part of that translation, the data types also need to be cast appropriately. And then going forward, things like upserts need to be taken care of as well. So those are a few of those like sort of native transformations that we do for all web applications, all sources that we have connectors for. And after the transformation, or sorry, after the load, we do recognize, of course, that there's the downstream modeling that needs to occur so that your reports are easier to create in the first place. So to support that, we actually have two types of functions available. One of them is our post-load SQL transformations, where we can immediately trigger a load, trigger a transformation in your warehouse immediately after loading or on a specific time frequency, similar to like your cron job. The latest thing that we actually came out with was an integration with DBT, where DBT is an open source software, free to use to start with, and it has a framework for running SQL-like transformations within your warehouse as well, and allows you to programmatically model those. And you can run DBT transformations by syncing with your GitHub repository, or sorry, connecting your GitHub repository inside Fivetran.
All right, so basically you've got the kind of the hooks to kick off that automation down the line, if you want to do that right natively in Fivetran. Very good. All right, so we're getting to the end of the questions we've got. We've got some. There are some very specific questions that folks have asked that we will follow up individually with, that may not be quite as much for the whole group. But this has been fantastic. I think it's really good to understand, you know, how Fivetran works, what it does, what kind of models it produces, and how folks can get started using it very quickly. So. With that, we do have one more poll for everyone on the call. If you could help us out with that. at the end of the day, we hope this webinar was valuable for you to learn something new about modern data stacks. And if you have any takeaways from that, we'd love to know about them. So, you know, what might you be interested in as a follow-up to this webinar? We'd love to be able to help you with a discussion around a modern data stack, if that makes sense, a deeper dive with Fivetran, maybe a data strategy whiteboarding session if you're just starting to think about where you're at in your process. And if you're all good to go, well, fantastic. And we wish you all the best with running your modern data stack. So, Brandon, thank you so much for participating in the webinar.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yes, awesome job, Brandon. Thank you, Jonathan. As a reminder, this session was recorded, and the recording will be sent out in the next day or so. And be sure to check out upcoming webinars that we have, as well as our archive library. And thanks so much for joining today. We hope to see you again next time.
Have a good rest of your days.